Okay, and it's my pleasure to introduce Amandine, who is a PhD student with Professor Emily Lyons, and she's going to be talking today about deforestation drivers in sub-Saharan Africa. So thank you all for coming. This is the last seminar for this term. We'll start again in September, but right now, Amandine, it's all yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for coming to my talk. So, as I said, I'm Amandine and I'm a second year PhD student in the Department of Geography. And today I will talk about new methods to automatically identify direct deforestation drivers using satellite imagery and deep learning. And just so we agree on the definitions, by direct deforestation drivers, I mean the direct activity that resulted in the land use change. So, for example, conversion to agriculture. And I don't mean the indirect or underlying factors that kind of created deforestation, which could be market growth or rise in the price of a commodity. And by deforestation, I mean the human-induced permanent removal of natural forests. I will also talk about degradation during my talk because it's often the first step before deforestation, and that includes also natural events such as fires, for example, and basically anything that will impact forest integrity. So during my talk, I will talk a bit more about why it's important to do that and identifying deforestation drivers, explaining my methodology, and especially the creation of a new label dataset, which in my opinion was kind of the most challenging part of the study. Talk a bit more about the deep learning approach that I used, and yeah, show you some results, especially comparing Lensa and Planetscope data. So let's start. I'm not seeing everything. I'm going to move the. Okay. So I think everyone probably knows here that tropical forests are important, but just to give you some numbers. So they support more than 30% of the population of tropical countries, and in some African countries, it's actually more than 75% of the population that relies on tropical forests for basic needs such as water, energy, and livelihood. And despite occupying only 10% of the Earth's surface, they are extremely biodiverse, store almost half of the terrestrial carbon, and are a major forest carbon, major carbon sink. So that's why it's so important on the international scene, and what we hear so much about deforestation in the news. So you probably heard about the recent COP26 pledge to end deforestation by 2030. There was also a recent law that was passed in the European Union to ban the imports of goods linked with deforestation. However, it's kind of commitments that are really not easy to implement. So in 2022, we've seen a rise in primary tropical forest loss by 10%. It's estimated that it represents 3.6% of human-induced deforestation, rise in human-induced deforestation, and we were approximately 1 million hectares above the target that we needed to be on track to follow this COP26 pledge to end deforestation by 2030. So it shows that to at least be on track, we need to better detect, better understand what's happening on the ground in order to make better informed, location-based decisions and generate incentives to kind of avoid this deforestation. So why am I focusing especially on sub-Saharan Africa and the Congo Basin specifically? So the Congo Basin is the second largest tropical forest in the world. It covers 340 million hectares, and it supports the livelihood of more than 8 million people. In sub-Saharan Africa, this is also where we've seen the largest annual net forest loss between 2010 and 2020, with on average 3.9 million hectares lost every year. This is also the region with the fastest agricultural expansion since 2015, with on average a rate of 2.4%, and it's expected to rise to 10% by 2025. And another reason why it's important to study the Congo Basin is because Central Africa has historically been less funded and studied. So little quiz time. What do you think is the percentage of the international funding for the protection of tropical forests that was invested in the Congo Basin? Anyone wants to try to guess?
10%.
2.
You're closer with 10%, actually. It was between 2008 and 2017, it was 11.5%. But as a comparison for the Amazon, it was 33% and 55% for East Asia. So it's also been less studied. So just as an example, the 2021 IPCC report on heat regulations included data from all over the world except Central Africa. So it shows that even within the African continent, we have some disparity. So to test my classification, I had to choose a case study. So my case study here is Cameroon. Why Cameroon? So first, because within the Congo Basin, it was the country with the sharpest average annual rise in primary forest and tree cover loss between 2016 and 2021. It's also the country with the second largest deforestation and degradation rates in the Congo Basin between 1990 and 2000. And another reason for this choice is because one of my supervisors who works at the International Institute for Sustainable Development has been working extensively in Cameroon, so it was an opportunity for collaborations and partnerships. So what is happening in Cameroon? So let's look at kind of the main deforestation drivers. So first we have large-scale and small-scale agricultural expansion, for example, for oil palm or cocaine. We also have the expansion of mining, especially artisanal small-scale mining for gold, for instance, and also development of infrastructure, especially in the south. We also have fuel and timber harvesting, which are the main reasons for forest degradation. And the problem is that these land-based investments, they don't end up benefiting the communities, and studies show that they actually benefit already powerful national or even international stakeholders. The problem is that there are land use changes that are difficult to track on the ground. First, because investors and government are not very transparent about their investments. Another problem is that, well, forest covers 48% of the country in Cameroon, so that's a huge area to kind of monitor, and especially since some areas are difficult to access because they are remote. And some areas are also difficult to access because they're kind of dangerous, especially because there are a lot of land tenure conflicts in Cameroon due to weak land legislation. And finally, we also have informal economies in Cameroon, which are quite common, which makes it difficult to kind of track all things. So this is why kind of Earth observation, especially satellite data, comes as the kind of logical answer to solve this problem. However, when we look at the literature and what has been done to look at these direct deforestation drivers, we see that it's been done mostly manually. So basically looking at the images, looking at the auxiliary data separately, and trying to visually interpret what's happening on the ground. And the problem is, you imagine that it's costly, it takes a lot of time, and if you don't have kind of the expert in your team, it's a bit difficult. There are, of course, some studies that have tried to use machine learning to identify the deforestation drivers. However, we noticed that they use kind of wide categories of drivers, such as just agriculture, which is not enough if we want to really prioritize interventions on the ground. So basically what we see in the Congo Basin and in Cameroon is that we have a lack of automated, detailed, comprehensive classification of deforestation drivers. So this is where what I'm presenting today is coming. So it's trying to solve this issue. And basically, the question that I'm trying to answer here is how much detail can we get about these direct deforestation drivers using Earth observation and data science. So I'll walk you through 3 steps. The first step, the creation of the reference data set with all of this data you can see here on the slide, talking a bit more about the deep learning approach and improvements that are tried with data extraction. So let's start with the creation of a reference label data set. So as I mentioned, it was difficult to obtain because in sub-Saharan Africa, this is usually what's kind of limiting is that we don't have reference data. So I tried to build this reference data set using different open source databases that you can see here, Landmatrix, Global Forest Watch, the Cameroon Forest Atlas. And to select them, I had different criteria. Of course, I needed data that I could download, which was not always the case. Data with that I had used trustworthy methodology, recent data and also information that kind of matched the deforestation drivers in Cameroon, of course. And from these data sources, I kind of cross-checked the information. I also had to do extra steps to kind of format the data, of course, and removed all the data that I found not that I didn't have enough confidence in, especially about the specific drivers I had there. So I then also defined my classification scheme. So you can see there are two of them. So to define that, I used the academic and grade literature, but I also carried out key informal discussions with people from NGOs, intergovernmental organizations, and research institutes. And of course, I looked at what was available in terms of data as well. So here we have two classification schemes. So first, by group. So we have plantation, grasslands, smallholder, agricultural, other. So this was the classification that was used in the study by Erwin et al. They tried to classify deforestation drivers in Indonesia. So you can see what I said about kind of wide categories already here. And I started from there because I'm using their model ForestNet as kind of my base model that I then modified for my study. What we're really interested in, though, is the detailed drivers, as I said before. So the type of plantation, the type of smallholder agriculture, and then a wide variety of land uses and other. What's especially important is mining here, because despite mining being a big deforestation driver in Cameroon, there is not one single map of mining in Cameroon. So that would be a great output. So this is kind of the general workflow. Of course, it's very small, you can't see anything. So I'll zoom a bit on the first part. Still a bit complicated to read, so I'll just give you the important information here. Basically, I used these shape files where I moved the land use, thanks to the data sources that I showed before, and overlay those with the global forest change products. So global forest change, for those of you who don't know, it's an annual product that is released for forest loss globally. And I only use data from 2015 because I wanted to have the most updated methodology and satellite data in order to be as accurate as possible. So let's look at the second part then, which was the generation of the creation of the images. So we had Lensa 8, which was pan-sharpened to 50 meters. We selected only the visible bands, and then we selected the image with the least cloud cover in the 5 years following the forest loss events. Then for Planetscope, we used the freely available data that was made available by the Norwegian International Climate and Forest Initiative. So they are monthly composites, they're not raw data, they're not the daily data that you get. And they are 4.77 meters for resolution. So you can see why we're kind of comparing to see if a better spatial resolution could increase our accuracy in our approach. So here again, I selected the RGB band and I selected the first composite available starting from the year following the forest loss events. I also added some auxiliary data on the presence of peats, elevation, the distance to streets, the distance to the closest city, and also infrared information and climate data. So that's a lot of data. If you want to talk about it later, I can show you more information about that.
The forest loss event is actually the JRC classification?
It's from the GSE, yeah.
Are you doing degradation or deforestation?
I'm using forest loss, but it also includes it also detects degradation, the global forest change. It's not as good as the DRC tropical moist forest product, for example, for degradation, but it still detects some of the degradation. But that's definitely a limit, so that's a good point. But I'm still trying to classify degradation as well, as I've shown in my classification with selective logging, modifier, kind of things. Okay. So moving on to the deep learning strategy that I used. So first, what's important to understand is that I'm doing the classification only within this forest loss area. So you see the white polygon on the slide, basically. Then I did data augmentation to have more data in my training data set. And then what ForestNet is using is a convolutional neural network. So I'll zoom a bit on that. So it's basically using a feature pyramid network architecture. So principle is just extracting feature maps at different, so for the bottom-up pathway, it's feed-forward ConvNet with upscaling factor of with a scaling factor of 2. And for the top-down, we're using just nearest neighbor. And then from these two pathways, we combine the feature maps with element-wise addition. And to extract, for feature extraction, we use efficient V2, which was pre-trained on the 2012 image net dataset. So basically what we obtain from it is then segmentation. So it's segmentation logics for each pixel. And for the auxiliary data, we aggregated them over the 5 years before the forest loss event, generating the mean, standard deviation, maximum and minimum, and then concatenate this with these segmentation logics and everything went through them three fully connected linear layers to obtain the class logic for the whole area to have the overall classification from our direct deforestation drivers. So basically what I did from the ForestNet model is that I modify it to kind of be able to use my new data set and also to include the new classification. I also tried to test decision level data fusion, so kind of basic data fusion, just doing the classification for each type of image and Sat8 Planetscope separately, and then taking the one with the highest accuracy. So let's see some results now. So starting with the classification by driver groups. So we're looking at confusion matrices here. So what we are trying to have basically is a diagonal with very light colors, because that would mean that predicted and actual label match. So we have predicted label on the x-axis, actual label on the y-axis. So the first thing that we can see here is that we have high accuracy, above 80% for these driver groups. We see that on the left for lambda 8, it's performing a bit better for all classes except smallholder agriculture compared to Planetscope, which is on the right. Another remark that I want to make here is that I also tried to use the Indonesian data from the urban study to try to do transfer learning and see if that would improve, because they just had more data basically. However, it actually made accuracy worse. Overall, but also for all classes except plantation, where it improved a bit, but only by 1%, so it's not very significant. So it just shows that depending on the area where we're looking, it's going to be really different patterns. So then let's look at the detailed drivers. So here, first thing we see, way more colors. So we can see that we have a varying performance depending on the classes. We checked that it was not linked with kind of the number of images that we have in the training data set, but just to make sure that it's not linked with that, and it's just not the problem here with these differences. So here again, very difficult to read. There's a lot of information, so I'm just gonna zoom a bit on the important parts, which are the ones that don't work that well. Starting with hunting. So we see here that it's confused with selective logging. And it kind of makes sense when you think about just looking at an image, because basically you're doing the same thing, you're just searching trees. So it shows that maybe we would need more information here to make a difference. So maybe some additional socioeconomic information would be helpful here. Then looking at fruit plantation, old palm plantation, and rubber plantation. So in the middle, we see old palm plantation is kind of the class that's doing worse, and it's confused with rubber plantation and selective logging mostly. Fruit plantation and rubber plantation are doing better, but they're still confused with other types of plantations or selective logging as well. So here we wonder if the problem is maybe because we're just using a single image approach. So of course, then if we're selecting the image and it doesn't match kind of the crop growing season, then we're gonna have an issue to see the difference between crops, basically. So this is where I think a time series would be helpful to kind of understand a bit more what's happening here and try to improve our accuracy. Then looking at Planetscope and comparing with Lensa 8. So here again, different performance depending on the classes, but it's not necessarily doing better despite the higher spatial resolution. So here again, we check that it does not link with the training data set and kind of imbalance between the classes. So let's look at the areas where it's doing worse than Lensa 8. So first we have hunting, so it was not working before too, but here it's doing a bit worse. Selective logging is doing quite well, but a bit less accurate than with Lensa 8. So the conclusion here is we see that it's kind of small scale changes, and with a higher spatial resolution, we do not necessarily have better results here with Planetscope. Then looking at all palpitation, here again we have the same issue as the one we had before, not really high accuracy. We see, however, that on top of kind of the confusion with reverse plantation and selective logging that we had before, we also have confusion with small-scale all palm plantation. So here we could wonder if it's linked with the way we generate the data. So first, it could be that we're downloading the monthly composites close to the forest loss event. Maybe didn't have time to kind of grow. Another issue that could be happening is as for Lensa, that is not matching the crop growing season. And another problem that we might hear is still that we have too many clouds. And maybe then the biannual composites that Nikki has also made available would maybe be better. Here again, the conclusion is that we need a time series approach to see if we can improve that. Two other categories that did a bit of a worse job compared to Lensa 8, other large-scale plantations, small-scale open plantation, and we see that they're either confused with selective logging or other types of plantations. So kind of the same conclusion as before, we would need a time series approach to understand what's happening better, to try to improve that, in my opinion.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
You have these various categories such as oil palm and small scale, oil palm and other, and small scale other. What does small scale mean?
It's just it's not this large scale kind of agro-industrial plantation where they're.
That's not a good answer. It's small scale, it's not large scale.
Yeah, no, you're right. But, it's basically it's also the difference is that usually there's intercropping, which is not happening in large scale plantation.
So they actually are materially different in the problem.
Yes, yes. So that's why we're hoping to see kind of the difference as well. And they also last for less time, I would say, because usually they would be planted and then it would be changed like another crop kind of often.
I mean, the intercrop would be changed.
The intercrop, even all palm usually doesn't last as long as the large scale plantation. Yeah, it's basically what is most like what makes people earn more money. So it can evolve quite easily, and also because I mentioned that with land tenure issues, it could be also that just people build the land and then do what they want on an already existing whole farm. That's kind of the main difference. Yes, so just it's also so we've seen where Planetscope is not doing as well as Lensa, but there are categories where it's doing better. So food plantation, grassland shrubland, infrastructure, mining, small-scale maize plantation, small-scale other plantation, and wildfire. Another remark that I wanted to make here is that I did different tests with different sets of data. And I wanted to ask the question, is it better to have more data, but maybe some data with kind of lower confidence, or is it better to have fewer data, but higher confidence, basically? And it didn't work at all with the first option, so a lot of data and lower confidence. So that's why I filtered the data, as I said before. So basically, the conclusion that we have this comparison with Planetscope and Lensa is that Planetscope is doing better for some classes, Lensa is doing better for some classes, and Planetscope is not necessarily doing better for small scale, right, a higher spatial resolution. So that kind of leads us to the logical step, which would be data fusion. So we're doing quite well for most classes where we have confidence higher than 70%. However, we still have 4 categories where it's not doing as well as I wanted to. So we have hunting, whole farm plantation, rubber plantation, but it kind of makes sense because if you remember from the previous slides, it was not working separately for Planetscope, it was not working well for Lensa, so of course with the data fusion, that's not really going to improve. The other thing is fruit plantation. Here is doing worse than it was doing separately for Planetscope. But here I think it might be also because we have a reduced data set, because basically we have to match the test data set from Lensa and Planetscope. So well, we have the same coordinates, otherwise it doesn't really make sense. So that's why maybe we don't have enough data to kind of have enough conclusion, especially where fruit plantation is a category where we have fewer data compared to others. So you've seen that it's kind of a work in progress still, and there are some steps that I'm considering to try to improve this approach. So first, I've only used global forest change as the first input, but I want to try with also the tropical moist forest products, which is better at detecting degradation. And I also want to see if it would work with differences with the GLAD and RAD alerts, which are released daily. So that would maybe be good if we're moving to kind of a intervention or monitoring approach here. What I want to highlight here also is that even though the data sources that I use are mostly from ground data, we have not tested on independently collected ground truth data yet. However, we're planning to do so with our partner, the NGO FODER, which is based in Yaoundé, and we're going to collect data in the south, where there has been a lot of recent land use changes, and also where we have a wide variety of driver types. However, we have to be kind of, you have to realize that we're never going to be able to have a lot of data at large scale, at least in the scope of my PhD, because, well, I mentioned some areas are really difficult to access, and there's also the problem with safety. So more kind of a, even maybe a philosophical question of how much data will be enough to kind of test this and be confident in this approach. So I've already mentioned, I also want to add additional socioeconomic data. I've only used the distance to the closest street and the closest city, but I want to add information, especially about land management type or conflicts, to see if we can improve the detection and of these drivers. And I've mentioned many times also the need for a time series approach. And finally, I think one of the problems with observation is that we often kind of do our studies and then we don't have a platform that's easy to use for a variety of stakeholders, especially for people on the ground. So I plan with the final product, of course, to have something that will be as an app on Google Earth Engine, or maybe if it works well, integrated on Global Forest Watch, so that it can be used by my partners and other people. So yeah, so I'm reaching the end of my presentation. So just some key messages. So I hope I've highlighted the fact that there's a real lack of reference data in sub-Saharan Africa, especially for small scale and kind of in a uniform way. So I think sometimes we focus a lot on kind of developing new models, where I think money should be invested in collecting data on the ground with local partners, because that's kind of the key. If we don't have good enough data from the start, I don't think we can improve that well. Another problem was to have data open. So I wanted to include cocoa plantation as a class. I mentioned it's a big driver in Cameroon, but I couldn't find any freely available data. And here, I think we should also encourage kind of have incentives to have people make their data available, and while also considering kind of potential privacy issues and make sure that it doesn't impact people on the ground, doesn't put a target on their back, basically. So I think that's could be another whole other conversation. And then the conclusion of Planetscope and Mensa. So we've seen their work. Planetscope works better on some passes, Mensa on some other passes, and Planetscope not necessarily doing better for small scale. However, it could be linked with the way I generated the data. So we need test it a bit more. And with the Planetscope data, we also have to realize that for the freely available data, at best, we're going to have data every month. So that could be still a limitation in the future. On a more positive notes, I hope I've convinced you that there's still potential for this approach to be used for monitoring, analysis, and intervention. However, for that to happen, it's really important to maintain close collaborations with local partners. So I mentioned the NGO further I'm working with. I'm also working with the Congo Basin Institute. And for example, I'm really interested in seeing the impact of community-based forest on conservation. So currently in Cameroon, there are reforms for like 10 years, so it would be interesting to use that to reform policy, and especially the case because there was a recent study that showed that in DRC, basically, these community-based forests really improved conservation. But in Cameroon, the situation is very different because they've been assigned on already degraded land. So it would be interesting to see kind of the differences. And finally, I think it would be also interesting to see if it can be used for other countries in the Congo Basin, especially if we don't have enough data for training, but only a small data set for testing. I expect there to be quite a lot of difference, especially if the drivers kind of do not match or the deforestation dynamics are different. However, I think it would be interesting to see kind of the limitations, have some recommendation for people who want to use it for another country, and yeah, have some conclusions on that for future work. So to conclude, I want to thank my supervisors, Dr. Emily Lyon and Dr. Emily Beauchamp. I also want to thank everyone who part in these key informant discussions that I mentioned and helped me on the field in Cameroon. And yeah, just the references for anyone who's interested. And yeah, thank you very much. It's my contact, and yeah, just let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you. Lots of questions.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. So I have a couple of questions. The first one is, I guess I didn't fully get what the reference data you used were. Is it just a stack of different files? Or?
Yeah, so I had so these different databases that I showed, like the video, and they come in really different formats, but I had to kind of reformat them, and it was shape files.
Okay. So there could be for each, and you're predicting the drivers at each pixel, or is it for each hash?
You mean when I'm creating the reference data?
When you're predicting what driver happens,
yeah,
it's for each pixel.
So I'm doing it for each pixel, and then kind of assigning a class for the whole forest first area that comes from global.
So it's for each hash.
But, yeah.
Okay. Another question was about in the end, when you're saying you're using the two data and then you had to kind of reduce the data was available somewhere. I was just wondering if there's a way for a model to kind of alternatively take so that it can use what Landsat when Landsat is available and when it's available, and then both when both are available.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. I think that's what I need to do actually. But yeah, I haven't done it yet. I've just used where I have it. But that's a good idea.
And one last question about degradation. You mentioned briefly that it also touches upon degradation. From the looks of it, that selective logging and hunting would be probably what we can call this degradation. Yes. But is it true that for every one driver that you visit, you can say, categorize them into either the vegetation or the vegetation, or are there some drivers which are kind of ambiguous?
I think each driver can be kind of classified in deforestation, degradation. However, if you look at the kind of process, you'd think that that's what I mentioned when it's kind of confused with selective logging. You think, oh, well, they're trying to fix culture to trees, that it might be selective logging, but at the end of the day, degradation will be like kind of a patch of an area where trees have been cut, whereas degradation would be just there still will be some trees then basically. So I think we can still see the difference. But I think there's a lot of debate among people and like way to define deforestation and degradation. So we might get another answer from other people.
Outside of these small scale estimates, like, did you look at, or are you thinking about like kind of regional, like sums of like, well, what portion of deforestation is caused by these different things? And if you did do that, were you surprised by any of the results? Did they match what other people have been estimating with different data?
So I haven't done that yet, but it's definitely my plan later. I just want to have something that's a bit more accurate first, if that makes sense. But I think what's going to be interesting is that historically we've had these small scale changes mostly, and it would be interesting to see kind of the portion of the large scale plantation, which people keep saying are not really happening in Cameroon, but when you're on field, like they're happening, and especially because it also happened kind of illegally on the borders of this plantation. So when you kind of look at the images, you're like, oh yeah, no, it's something else. It's kind of this small scale, but it actually still is a large scale plantation, just extended illegally.
If I build on that question, I mean, we have many different drivers, right? But some drivers are probably more important than others. So if you get the confusion matrix to be accurate, small scale one, you're treating all of them equally. That's not the right thing. Maybe hunting only contributes to 0.1% and large scale oil to 50%. So you should focus, just from a perspective of machine learning on those which are the largest causes to get those accurate, even at the expense of making other causes inaccurate, right? So you don't need to make them all accurate. So I think that could be the understanding I had from the Rachel Garrett's book, that essentially oil palm is the single biggest driver, and cocoa is not in your list. Like mining is intensive at small scale, but oil palm is extensive in terms of its scale.
Well, yes, but then also what's I think well, that's definitely a good point, and I should try to do that. But also I think there's not a lot of information about what is most important, I think, in terms of small scale. So if I want to select the important small scale, I wouldn't know with the information in the.
Okay, but you can answer that because you do have some ground truth for your training data.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So that ground truth, if you trust that,
Yeah.
then the proportions in those should be telling you hopefully what's happening. If the ground truth is selected as a random sample, not a biased sample, then it is showing in the ground truth 50% is oil palm, then you can expect that that's 50% of the prediction is oil palm. So the ground truth data will be giving you a hint.
Yeah, no, that's true. I just have to assume that I have enough for all of this small scale. This is kind of where I'm sure. For the large scale, I think that's definitely important, and because all palm is so important, as you mentioned, it's the same in Cameroon. It's a lot of oil palm, a lot of rubber. Yeah, for the small scale, I have to stress then that I have all the information available, which is not really the case.
Yeah.
So to make an estimation about that would be a bit difficult, but for the large scale, okay.
Thank you. Any other?
So how critical do you think the reason why deforestation happens? So for small or large scale, okay, we know it's not accurate, but in terms of like actual on the ground, how does that make a difference?
Okay, so for different reasons, first, to select kind of where to intervene. So we've seen on the on this cloud red alert, there's a lot of them, and there's not enough money or people to go on the ground and kind of investigate what's happening. So that would help in the first place, I think. And also what my partners are really interested in is knowing what's kind of illegal, what's expected in an area. So here, knowing what's actually happening on the ground could help. So is this something we expect? Are there people just encroaching on other people's land? Something that we did not expect?
There's an implicance for the reason.
Yeah.
That I'm sure that.
Mhm.
Like what physical principle do you think would happen? For example, Sentinel-2 has water vapor as one of its spots. Do you think having that information would provide more information to distinguish between other reasons of things?
It might, I'm not sure. I would have to think about it, but yeah, it might. Yeah. I think that the most like the logical step would be first to have kind of this. But yeah, that would be another interesting route to go and look at other data. Maybe random data also see where it can pick up as well. That would be interesting. I know it's rather data has been used for selective logging quite a lot, so that might.
Intuitively, Planet would ideally provide more granular images. Not clear on why.
Well, I'm not sure either, but I think, yeah, as I mentioned, it might be because the way that I can read the data doesn't really, is not good enough in find elements of deforestation. And also another reason might be this, because we only have a monthly computers. So it might be that there's some processing that was already done by Planet in the first place that kind of changed the nature of the data. Because basically we're not looking exactly at the same data and Planetscope data. One will be a 100 days, one will be like a raw image at 1.5. But yeah, that's kind of also what I'm still trying to answer.
Related to this, you made your task a bit complicated by focusing only on RGB. So, I mean, you said the temporal information will add certainly, and we discussed yesterday how we could, let's say, convert the information in the temporal series into, let's say, features, right? But then using RGB only, was this related to the pre-existing architecture, that this architecture only accept 3 bands, because most of the information is outside of the RGB. So one channel in, let's say, the visible, one additional in the near infrared, and one in the sphere would have been better for Landsat for sure. For Planet, I don't know what is available, but it seems to me that you underutilize somehow, let's say, the spectral information which is available.
Well, I used the infrared as auxiliary data. I just didn't use as an image basically. So I looked at the infrared data as other auxiliary data in like 5 years before, and then I had the mean, but I didn't use the layers.
I don't understand.
So basically, I used the infrared data and then looked at the mean standardization, maximum and minimum, sorry, in the 5 years before the first those events. So that's how I'm using this data, but it's not as if I use like the whole layer, of course. The reason for that was, as you said before, the Planetscope basically we don't have as much information in terms of bands. We only have the near infrared. We don't have as for Landsat 8. So that's why I only use the visible. But yeah, that would be interesting to see if not using this infrared information as kind of auxiliary data, but using it as integrated in the image basically as a layer, maybe that would improve as well.
Yeah, and as was said before, I mean, in principle, all spectral bands, right? I mean, this water vapor band just clarify, it comes at 60 meter, right?
Mm.
So usually it was really designed for detecting or quantifying atmospheric water vapor. But I've seen also many papers who use it for land cover classification. It adds a bit of information. It's not really clear why, but it helps. I have one more or two more comments. Because they said there's almost no information about mining available. So I have a friend, he compiled a global data set on mining activities. So Victor in Vienna, this group of economic university in Vienna. Okay, they say they have the globally best mining data set. So perhaps this can be helpful.
Yeah.
So as a driver, it was not clear, almost clear to me, but why fire? I mean, fire for me is a cover type. Let's say after the deforestation event, but probably it doesn't remain fire. So probably it's easy to detect because you have the scars and you see, okay, it was fire, but probably it was just a mean to, I don't know, to do grazing afterwards or what, yeah?
Well, here it's mostly to look, yeah, that's a good point. Here I consider it more as like degradation, so more like a natural event, more than something that would be created by a human to then clear land. Because then as you mentioned, I wouldn't consider it as the driver, because it's just to cut the trees and then plant something else, basically. So here it was more for these kind of natural fires that happen. That's why I included it. But,
Yeah, mostly they're probably not natural, no?
Well, yeah, I don't know.
Question about how you constructed the ground truth data set. So I understand that you use global forest change for the deforestation data. I understand that sometimes that data set can overestimate the deforestation. I was just wondering whether you ran up to any discrepancies between, when GFC said there was deforestation, but your other data layers didn't seem to corroborate that, and how you might have dealt with that.
I didn't really look at that, if I'm being honest. Because I had kind of a limited number of data, and also because I was not really estimating kind of the area itself, I didn't really look at that. But that's a good point, and that's also why I need to kind of cross-check with other forest loss products because of that. Sorry, it doesn't really answer your question, because, but that's a good remark. And
Any other questions? Yes, sorry. Go ahead.
So my background's been in computer science, and I think it's interesting to see all these talks where there's a lot of like kind of ecology and conservation results, but I was kind of interested in, there's a lot of computation that goes on, whether it's the data modeling or the running big models and stuff like that, and maybe you could talk a little bit about the struggles of doing that, or perhaps any like insights into some good things that went well, like you tried a certain library or you tried a certain way of doing it that worked quite well.
Yeah, so my main struggle was the training time. It takes a long time to train this model, and one of the other issues I faced, well, that's just me for us, but maybe other people that think is to use the kind of university HPC for the that was interesting experience, and yeah, if anyone has managed to have information from them, please. Yeah, I've given up. Pretty, yeah. When I went to Cameroon, basically, I was still talking to them, and then I came back and I kind of gave up. So that was kind of one of the issues. Other than that, I guess there were the code that I used was also is not published actually, so it's still a private repository. So of course, it was not necessarily organized for publication, if that makes sense. So there were a lot of kind of trial and error to try to adapt this code for my application. That was kind of my, I don't know if it answers the question, but yeah. A lot of
Yeah, it sounds very familiar.
One question about, you talked about data fusion, what exactly are you fusing?
Yeah, so I'm
And what, and it sounds like the fusion is coming very late.
yes.
So, and is there a way of bringing the fusion earlier or different fusion architectures? Would that have an impact on the results?
That's a really good point, and that's something I've been considering as well. I've really done the kind of easiest option
Yeah.
of just doing the fusion level, so just.
Yeah, it seems
yeah.
like it might be a bit, it could be a bit limiting.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
one thing that I'm considering, because I'm using that kind of feature pyramid
Yeah.
where I'm changing the scaling, maybe it would be to do the fusion at this step. But yeah, I haven't tried it, and that's definitely to explore as well. That's a good point. Other than that, yeah, I mean, there are all the traditional kind of data fusion ones,
Yeah.
just like with the band basically that you merge. I don't know how that would work.
What
to
do
be
you,
honest.
what do you merging, what are the data? You're treating each band as separate, and then you're trying to do what are the different things you're trying to fuse? Sorry,
Yeah, no, so what I've done so far, you mean?
yeah.
No, I'm not using the images themselves. I'm kind of looking at doing the classification for each separately and then.
Yes, each what, sorry.
Oh, yeah, each the LGB images that I mentioned, so Lenta 8, Planetscope. Yeah, so I'm not using at the kind
Okay,
of.
so
Yeah,
it
that's-
sounds like you should
Yeah.
fuse earlier. with
Yeah,
that.
that's kind of, that maybe. Yeah,
Vibration then.
well, yeah, having both the same input in the model, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we discussed yesterday, right? I done it with the battle twin for forest high destination, and then we had some nice discussions. I mean, my proposition is still open, right? We should really leverage the time circle.
Yeah.
And at the same time, all the spectral information. I understood you wanted to make it comparable. From your first
That's-
idea was,
that's
look
why-
how Planet does compared to Landsat, so you made sure you had the same kind of input. But now you want to have the best accuracy, right? In order to get the best accuracy, you need to have the best input available, and this is how spectral bands fused, let's say, at the very beginning, not at the end, and then the time series of these two together. And I think this kind of stuff that we presented would work very well with this kind of application.
Yes, that would be interesting to yeah. As you mentioned, it was for comparison, but now that I've seen that, yeah, I still have some problems with that.
Yeah, probably the Planet problems come from the fact it's very well known that they don't co-register very well. Now, if you trace monthly composites, right, you exaggerate these problems, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in what you call the raw image in Landsat is a high quality
Yes, exactly.
image, you know, raw sounds a bit bad, right? But it's not as synthetic, it's really observed.
And I mean, this co-registration error is definitely going to be blurring everything, but I mean. Any other questions from anybody?
Does SAR work as well?
I haven't tried yet, but that would be interesting.
Okay, I think we're all set. Let's thank them. Thanks for all your questions. Amandine,